Okay. Well, good morning and welcome to our new series, Mysticism and Mitzvot, or the Kabbalah of Mitzvot. I want to take a look at four mitzvot or mitzvah themes within Judaism and how the mystics have taken them. We're looking at Kashrut this week, Torah study next week. And I am blanking on the rest of the list. Mezuzah is one of them. What did we have as the fourth? Anyone remember? Shabbat. Thank you. Shabbat is the fourth. You can see that I haven't prepared the last week's of this class yet. That's okay. We're good. But if you didn't receive the email with the source sheet that I sent out on, I think it was Saturday night or Sunday, if you didn't get that email, and you haven't signed up since, please make sure I have your email by the end of today so that I'll be able to include you. I send out follow-up emails from the classes. So if you registered in between Sunday and now, it's okay. Then I have your email address. One note, as was noted by, I think it was Sarah. I think so. The third Wednesday of this series is the Fast of Esther, is Tanit Esther. Yes, we are having class that day. I hope you're able to make it. There was just no other way to do it in terms of the schedule to get in a Wednesday series other than having to go through that. And I find that if you skip a Wednesday, it throws everything off. It throws me off. It throws off, people forget there was a class. So I figured we'll go through it. Hopefully people can make it. If you can't, as always, I try to send out afterwards the link to the audio recording, and you'll be able to get it that way. All right. Anyone who doesn't have a sheet, there are extra sheets over there. Betty, thank you again for volunteering and helping out with the passing out the sheets, collecting, and so on. I just want to make sure everybody knows she's volunteering to do this. Please don't give her a hard time. No one gives her a hard time. Okay.
Rona's afraid I went for coffee on her money.
There we go. So, what we're going to see in this series, I hope to spend some time today on just the basics of what is Kabbalah, what is its worldview. Some of you were at a mini-series I did on that a few years ago, one of the June series. We had an introduction to Kabbalah then, but nonetheless, a refresher is good. Before we get into the specific mitzvot that we're going to be talking about today, being Kashrut. And what I want to get to, really, is sort of a global understanding. How does Jewish mysticism understand what we are doing when we perform a mitzvah, when we do something, or when we refrain from doing something we shouldn't do, right? In Kashrut, it's very often about what we're not supposed to do. So, what is the effect of what we do from a mystical perspective? And so I wanted to start with source number 1 on your sheets, a passage from the Zohar. We could spend 4 weeks just on what the Zohar is. That's really its own thing. What I'll say right now is that the Zohar is in many ways the foundation of modern Kabbalah study. It is a text which is basically written in Aramaic, structured at its core as a commentary to the Chumash, although there's much more to it. It is traditionally attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a sage from the time of the Mishnah. You're talking 1st century Common Era. However, the Zohar does not show up in published form until the 13th century, 13th, 14th century, which raises certain questions, like where was it all along, if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wrote it. Further, there are sages who are quoted in the Zohar who lived after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Granted, he's brilliant, but to not only know that they existed after him, but to write down their words is quite the feat. It's generally understood that the core of the Zohar is ancient, but that in the manner of Jewish text, elements were added over time. But it is considered a fundamental text within the study of Jewish mysticism. So take a look at this piece I quoted for you in number 1. It's on Parshat Shmini. That in and of itself tells us something. The laws of Kashrut appear in the Torah in terms of the lists of the kosher and non-kosher creatures in 2 places. One is the Parsha of Shmini, the beginning of the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and then the other is in the portion of Re'eh, which is in Devarim and Deuteronomy. Lists are almost the same, not quite the same, but almost the same. But here we're commenting on the first appearance of the list of kosher and non-kosher creatures in the Torah, and it says the following: whether domesticated animals, wild animals, birds, or fish, all of them display right or left, which I have in parentheses here, mercy or justice. The right side is associated with mercy. The left side is justice. You're asking or you're thinking, what, right side of what? Left side of what? Don't worry about it. We're all confused right now. All of them display right or left. And any that come from the right side, the side of mercy, one may eat. Those that come from the left side, the side of justice, one may not eat, because their natures are all impure, and they are all impure. And an impure spirit rests upon them, and they live in it. And the Holy Spirit of Israel shall not mix with them and become impure from them, so that they will be found holy. What are we talking about? It doesn't? Uh-oh. Well, Sandy has decreed. Okay. So, what does this mean? What can you make of this?
Kosher isn't a physical, it's a spiritual.
Right. For sure, this is presenting to us the categories of kosher and non-kosher creatures as something that is about our spiritual health, not about our physical health, but about our spiritual health. And what it's claiming is that the creatures God created are associated with traits that we want or traits that we do not want. But this in and of itself is odd and difficult. Because which ones are we supposed to stay away from according to this passage in the Zohar? Justice. Are Jews supposed to stay away from justice? Tzedek, tzedek, tirdov. You're supposed to run after justice. Right? So why are we here presented as fleeing from it and not eating it and not consuming it? That's a question that we may be able to learn something about and to address here. But the fundamental idea seems to be that when a creature is labeled non-kosher, that there's something about it that is spiritually harmful. Where does this come from in Judaism? Do we have any basis for this anywhere in Judaism? The idea that what you eat can somehow affect your spiritual health? Does this resonate with anything? Anything familiar with this? Uh-oh. We'll have to see. Because yes, the answer is yes, but we have to find out where. We have to see what this is founded upon. And then the question is this sort of standard in Judaism? Is this something that mystics deal with? How is this viewed in the general approach of Judaism? And again, as I said before, what is this going to tell me about how Kabbalah understands, how mysticism understands what we're doing when we follow the laws that we're given? So, background. What is Kabbalah? The word itself means? Right, to receive. A received tradition. Originally, Kabbalah was taught teacher to student. Small groups. The word in English, what word? That's associated. The Kabbal, right? A Kabbal. C-A-B-A-L. Kabbal. Depends on how you pronounce it. But it means this group that meets, that has a quasi-cult status. They have their tradition, and that's what's passed on teacher to student. In this case, Kabbalah, which is this received tradition, is something that has always been an element of Judaism. Meaning, there has always been, you go back to the beginning of the Torah, a sense that information is being conveyed, knowledge is being conveyed, that you won't find in a biblical text. You know that already very, very early on in the Torah. The story of Noah. Noah gets on the boat. He brings animals with him. How many of each kind of animal does he bring? No. Sorry. 7. 7. 2. How do you have 7 plus 2?
Always pairs.
That's true. It's 7 pairs or 2 pairs. This is true.
One's for the sacrifices, these 7.
One's for the sacrifices. So that's jumping ahead one step. Step back first. God tells Noah that he is supposed to bring 7 from the creatures that are, 7 pairs from the creatures that are tehorah, which we will translate as pure. 2 pairs from those that are einena tehorah, that are not pure. And yes, when he gets out of the boat and he brings korbanot, he brings offerings to God, that comes from the ones that he's brought 7 pairs of. It comes from those that are tahor. But we don't ever find God telling Noah which ones are tahor creatures and which ones are not tahor creatures. Later in the Torah, when the laws of kashrut are presented, those are introduced as the laws of animals that are tahor and animals that are not tahor, and then we understand, that's what he was doing. So he brought 2 pairs of each of the non-kosher species and 7 pairs of each of the kosher species. But what I don't know is, how does Noah know? How does he know what a kosher animal is and what a non-kosher animal is? The answer has to be, there is some kind of information that God is providing. It had no use until Noah's day, because when was it that human beings are allowed to eat animals in the Torah? After the flood. At this stage, there's no such thing as kosher and non-kosher. They're all not kosher. So God has to be conveying some kind of information to Noah, such that he's going to know what is kosher and what is not kosher. But that's brand new. That's not something that you're going to find anywhere in the biblical text. You will not find at that stage any sort of a list, and more information is being conveyed. Jump ahead in time. The time of Abraham and Sarah. Take a look at source number 2. This is a classic. It's built on a verse in Genesis chapter 26. Rav, a sage from the beginning of the 3rd century, said the following: Abraham fulfilled the entire Torah. Abraham fulfilled the entire Torah, even though at his time you only have the 7 laws that are supposed to be for all human beings, and even though the Torah has not been given at Sinai yet, the Jews have not stood at Sinai yet, there are no Jews yet, nonetheless, he's anticipating. On what basis do you say that? Because the biblical verse says, Ekev asher shama Abraham b'koli, God says, because Abraham listened to my voice, and in the Hebrew, vayishmor mishmarti, he guarded my preserve, mitzvotai, chukotai, v'torotai, my commands, my statutes, and my teachings. Says Rav in the Talmud, that's way more than saying that he observed the 7 laws that are common for all human beings. They didn't kill, they didn't steal, they didn't worship idols. This is more than that. He's fulfilling everything. But again, then you have to ask, how did he get that information? How does he know all of these different teachings? The Torah never says to us that he spent 40 days on top of a mountain and God, conveyed the Torah to him. There's an assumption that something else is going on. That God is having communication with human beings, and it's not recorded in the text of the Torah. At best, it's hinted at. Now, the question of what Abraham did and didn't do is a fascinating question. You can go a lot further with that. Like, does that mean that Abraham has a Passover Seder at which he talks about how his descendants will one day be slaves in Egypt, and one day Moshe is going to come along and take them out? Right? It's a little bit hard to wrap our minds around that concept. But we don't need to dive into the specifics, because it's not the point. The point is that the biblical text is already conveying to us that there's more going on than what you see in the literal text. One more example of this is source number 3 from a Midrash, building on again a verse in Bereshit in Genesis, where the Torah says that Abraham and Sarah and their family pick up and move from Haran to the land of Canaan, which becomes Israel. And it says they brought with them the nefesh they made in Haran. What does the word nefesh mean? Soul. Right? It doesn't have to. The truth is, nefesh doesn't have to mean that, but that's often what it does mean, certainly the way we use it colloquially. And that's the way the Midrash here understands it. That Abraham and Sarah bring with them the nefesh they made in Haran. It means they brought people.
And nefashot is another word for people.
Right, exactly. So the way that it's read, as the Midrash goes on here in number 3, is Abraham converted the men, Sarah converted the women. Now, conversion here does not mean what it means today. How do you know that that's not what conversion there means? Well, certainly it's hard to find anyone to staff your rabbinical court. That's a good point. What else, though?
If they have necklace.
Why not? Where else did you swim? On a very basic level, because we don't find them, these people, anywhere after this. Meaning, Abraham and Sarah have Eliezer, right? Eliezer, Abraham's servant, that we know. There are some youths, unidentified youths, who are around. However, in just a couple of generations, they're going to go down to Egypt, and it's just the family. If they had really converted to Judaism, if they had really adopted whatever this is that Abraham is doing, that Sarah is doing, I would have expected to have some hangers-on. They moved with them from Haran into Canaan, so where did they go? So the answer is conversion doesn't mean conversion. That's not what we're really trying to suggest. But it suggests that there is something that they are teaching people. Belief in God. There's something there. So that what that means is, again, there is additional information that is being transmitted, and what the mystics argue is that's the religion of Abraham and Sarah, and that's what becomes Kabbalah, the received tradition. So take a look, please, at source number 4. Source number 4 is from Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin was the chief student of someone known as the Vilna Gaon. You may be familiar with him. We quote him from time to time. The Vilna Gaon was the leading sage of Lithuania at the end of the 18th century, the latter half, I should say, of the 18th century. Chief opponent of the Hasidim back in that day as well. So his student, his lead student, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, founded the yeshiva in Volozhin. That was the greatest yeshiva of Europe in that, basically, that entire period. From then, really, until the end of the 19th century, when it was closed. And that's a story in and of itself. But look at what he has to say here in his work, Nefesh HaChaim. He says, just as a person's entire body ascends and is purified by involvement in Torah and Mitzvot, so all of the realms are purified and elevated. When you engage in learning Torah, when we're sitting here at the table, when you do a mitzvah, you are purifying all of the realms, the universe. A righteous person who truly serves God will not focus his mind and thoughts elsewhere while serving God, even to elevate and purify his body and spirit, but he will intend only for the purity of his thought and intent to ascend and focus above, for the repair and purification of the holy realms. He says that's your focus. Your ideal focus when you're doing a mitzvah is purification of the rest of the universe. But the key... Tikkun Olam, yes. And then the key phrase for our purpose, the key passage for our purpose. This was the entire service of the Avot. Right? The patriarchs, the matriarchs, that's what they were doing. And early righteous ones who fulfilled the Torah before it was given, they were involved in elevating the Olamot, elevating the universe. Wow. So, what you have then is essentially a shadow Torah. You have the Torah that we read Shabbat morning that gives us the basic text. You have, of course, rabbinic commentary and expansion on that. But all along, you have something else that's being transmitted. You have this mystical tradition that was practiced back in the day that is hinted at in the biblical text. We know something is going on, but it doesn't say what it is. That's simultaneous. That's going on at the same time as all of this. And Abraham is actually credited with writing a book called Sefer Yetzirah. What does Sefer Yetzirah mean?
Book of creation.
Book of creation. What does that mean? Well, take a look at source number 5. That will tell you exactly what this book is. Rava is is a sage from the time of the Talmud. You're talking now, we're moving ahead in history from some of the sages we quoted earlier. He's, I believe, 5th century. Rabbah created a man. In case anyone was curious, he doesn't give you the recipe. Rabbah created a man and sent him before Rabbi Zerah. Rabbi Zerah spoke to him, but he didn't respond. Oh, Rabbi Zerah said, "You must be from the magicians. Return to your dust." He says, "Yeah, that's not really a person. It doesn't speak." Right. Well, that's where the golem idea comes from. Right. There was no golem in Prague. I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings. There was no golem in Prague. Whatever it is that's in the attic in the Altneuschul is not a golem. Maharal had other things to do with his time. But the idea of a golem is based on this passage in the Talmud. Other passages as well, but this is actually the core one. Rav Chanina and Rav Oshia, 2 other sages, sat all day Friday immersed in Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, this book that we say is ancient mysticism. And they created a fat calf and ate it. Because what else would you do? Right? They made lunch. So we have this notion of what you could call practical Kabbalah, mysticism, that you could use. So, after the time of the Talmud, you have this chain of tradition, teacher to student, that is transmitting information that is claimed to be what was going on behind the scenes biblically. Are we clear? We're clear on what this is? I don't mean are we clear like, okay, I'm good with this. But in terms of the concept of mysticism, this is a 15-minute, well, closer to 20, fine, introduction to what Kabbalah is supposed to be. It's the claim that this is the information that's being passed down from the beginning that fills in the gaps for stories like this, like Noah knowing which creatures are kosher and non-kosher, but also is involved not just in sort of more mundane details of kosher and non-kosher, but also purification of elevated realms of the universe. The ability to bring this stuff to life. That's another piece of this. Elaine.
What exactly do they mean by realms of the universe?
So what they're talking about, if I knew more, I could give you a better answer than this, but I'm not someone who spends a lot of time on Zohar and mysticism. But what we're roughly talking about are Olamot HaElyonim, which is to say higher realms, and the idea, well, let me digress a little bit into Plato, and that may help. Believe it or not, there's a core problem that the Greeks dealt with and the mystics dealt with as well, and they came up with a solution that's pretty similar, not the same, but pretty similar. The problem is this: God is not physical. God has no body, He has no physical form. All the times when you see in the biblical text any sort of reference to anything remotely physical for God, we understand it to be use of human speech in order to make God intelligible for people who are reading about God. But God has no physical identity. So the problem is, we live in a very physical world. If God is not physical, how does God interfere? How does God get involved? There's no interface between the two planes. And so the truth is that as someone who lives in a rational age, in an age that doesn't focus on issues of mysticism really, the question doesn't really bother me. He's God. He does it. Or she, if you like. It doesn't make a difference. Doesn't have a body anyway. But leave it to God. God figures out how that interface works. But for those philosophers, again, Jewish side, mystics, Greeks, they loved this. This was a real issue, like a make or break issue. You have to answer this question. So what the mystics came up with, and again the Neoplatonists have a similar idea, is that the world that is 100% spiritual can communicate with a world that is 99.9% spiritual and 0.1% physical. And that world can interface with a world that is a little more physical. And so on and so on. There's this notion of worlds and worlds and worlds of increasing physicality until you get to our realm. And so those worlds that are in between are these other realms. Olamot HaElyonim, they're higher realms in the sense that they are more spiritual, and that God's influence is channeled through those into this world. I don't know if that made any sense to you, but that's the explanation.
No, I understand. But this maybe is a quantum leap, but this doesn't have anything to do with, or does it, the notion of the Neshamot having aliyah.
Very good question. So MordechaI Luzzatto was an Italian scholar. I believe he's 18th century. And he wrote a few books. And in one of them, called Derech Hashem, he talks about how all of our neshamot, all of our souls, are connected in a chain, ultimately going to the divine throne. And so when the Torah talks about a punishment of karet, God cutting somebody off, it's the idea of severing them from that chain. And maybe you can, within that context, talk about aliyat neshama, the idea that the neshama is ascending somehow on that chain.
There's a lot of luminous emanations that you're talking about?
Yes, when you talk about sphirot, divine emanations, that's also that realm of influences that are passing down through these levels.
I have another question. This last quote here, is that the basis for saying that the white magic that some adherents of Kabbalah are able to...
Good. So the answer is yes. The Talmud has discussions about magic. The Torah prohibits use of magic in general, but it distinguishes between, the Talmud distinguishes between making use of methods that God has put into the Torah and making use of what's considered to be opposition to God. So white magic, black magic are terms that are used contemporarily for it. There's a notion, what's the word in Hebrew for magic? Kesem is one word, usually associated more with sorcery. There's another one? Kishuf. That's what you say? Kishuf, kafshin, pei. Mechashefa is not a bad Yiddish word. It is actually a witch in Hebrew. But the Talmud has a same passage actually where number 5 appears, where it says that Kishuf stands for Machashefa stands for Makhishin Pamalia Shalmala, weakening the forces of heaven.
Weakening.
Yeah, it's an idea that it's somehow opposed to God. But I'm going to actually move further within this, because otherwise we'll never get to Kashrut. There's a lot more that you could discuss on this. Well, it was a series. We did it a few years ago. We did an intro to Kabbalah. It's a few years back. Maybe we'll do it again at some point. But the goal of this received tradition, if you take a look at source number 6, Professor Isaiah Tishby, Wisdom of the Zohar, he writes, Kabbalistic teaching is extremely wide-ranging, impinging on every area of existence and seeking solutions from a religio-mystical point of view to the mysteries of the world and problems of life. Meaning, what is God? How does God interact with our world? How does a human being interact with God? The way I like to think of it is, if you ask someone, right, if you came into this room and the lights were off, right? So you ask somebody who's standing there, how do you turn on the light? There are 2 answers they can give you. Either they can point you to the light switch, right, and say it's over there, or they can say there are circuits behind the wall and they tap into the electrical system. And there's something called AC current and there's something called DC current and so on and so forth to give you all the physics. Halacha, Jewish law, focuses on the light switch. Here's how you turn on the light. You walk over there, you take 3 steps, you say a bracha, and then whatever it is. But then you turn on the light. That's what you do.
That's an excellent analogy.
Thank you. Whereas Kabbalah is more interested in what's going on behind the wall when you turn on the light. What is the impact of what you do? How does it relate to the power source, so to speak? That's where Kabbalah goes with this. It's much more about knowledge, much less about practicality. And the truth is that many philosophies do this. They try to speak to what's really going on and what's behind and give a deeper understanding of the universe. But what marks something as Kabbalah is the fact that it is this received tradition, and that creates a little bit of a problem. Take a look at number 7, please, from Professor Gershom Scholem. He writes, the Kabbalistic movement in Judaism cannot be described adequately according to the categories of the history of philosophy. It can only be explained in terms of the history of religions, however close its connection with philosophy, and what he means by that is that it's dogma. You can't debate Kabbalah. If someone comes to you and says, I have a received tradition that dogs are from the left side, whereas chickens are from the right side, and therefore chickens are kosher and dogs are not kosher, and you can't say to them, but I don't understand, that doesn't make sense to me, because goats are associated with demonology, and yet goats are kosher. The logic doesn't work. His answer will be, too bad, this is my received tradition. That's what it means when you have a received tradition. It doesn't have to fit. It's not answerable to anyone.
Is there anything contradictory in the Kabbalah, like when you have
Yes.
the Gemara and that, and
Yes.
or somebody says this and somebody says that?
So you will have schools of mysticism, schools of Kabbalah. When the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, came to Tzfat in the 16th century, he revolutionized the study of Kabbalah, overturning what existed there in Tzfat and bringing in a whole new wave. But Kabbalah is responsible to Judaism. It's responsible to Torah, but it doesn't have to answer the questions it raises. That's why you have traditions within Judaism about not studying Kabbalah until one has completed the Talmud, until one has reached a certain level of stability in life. Because you could study Kabbalah and come away with impressions that are completely opposite where Judaism and Torah tend to be. So, for example, I'm sure you've come across at some point the idea that Kabbalah has male and female identities for God. There's the Shekhinah is feminine and Elohim is masculine, and that can lead you down a path that says that God actually has some physicality and has some personality that is like, human personality. There's stuff like that within, not to mention multiple gods, because once you start asking that question, so what does that mean? There's a male God and there's a female God. How do I even begin to take that? Because it leads to all sorts of problems, therefore the answer generally is, don't pick this up unless you're really ready to make it work with the rest of Jewish tradition. And so largely people, I think, ignore it. Unless there are people who are looking for mysticism. Very often you'll find people who will only take that, and they won't take the rest of Judaism. They'll leave behind the rational and the practical. Okay, that's a little bit about what Kabbalah is. Now I want to turn to kosher and ask, so where do these meet? What is it about kashrut, about the laws of keeping kosher, that Kabbalah needs to explain? Why do I need Kabbalah to address keeping kosher? Why would someone ask Kabbalistic questions? Why would you approach a Kabbalist for information about kashrut?
But kosher sometimes doesn't make sense.
Right. Because it doesn't make sense. No, that's the answer.
It doesn't tell us why not eat meat and milk together. It doesn't really make sense. We find lots of excuses or reasons, but they don't.
We find many reasons, and we're going to go through some of them, but that's the fundamental problem. Kashrut is not presented in the Torah with a logical explanation. It doesn't offer a logical explanation, and not only that, the explanations that we do find, which we're going to go through some of momentarily, tend to deal with the generalities of kashrut. So you'll find an answer like, you'll see. We're going to see some shortly, but it's a way to invest your eating with holiness. That you'll think about God every time you're going to eat. That's beautiful, but it doesn't explain why chicken is kosher and fill in the blank, whatever, is not kosher. Right? That's not expressed. That only tells me that there has to be such a thing as kosher. It doesn't tell me why it is the way it is. Ricky, you were going to say? Ricky? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that these things are stated in the Torah, and why do they have to?
Because people want to understand what they're doing. Right? We like to know what the impact is of what we do.
But isn't that the word of Hashem, and that we shouldn't really?
So that's one approach. And we're going to come back to that approach shortly. So let me not go into that just yet, but we're getting there. If you want, you can look ahead to number 13, where we'll get to that. But we're not there yet, so everybody else shouldn't look. We have rational explanations for the general issue of kashrut. So, example, take a look at source number 8, please. Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, also known as Rashbam, a grandson of Rashi, who says, here's my explanation. According to the straightforward text, Pshat, what it says in the Torah, and as we respond to the heretics, all of the domestic and wild animals, birds, fish, locusts, and crawling creatures which God listed for the Jews are repulsive, and they corrupt and overheat the body. They're bad for you. Take a look at source number 9. Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch is written anonymously. It is believed by many to be associated with Rabbi Aaron Halevi, 13th century Spain. There's some debate as to who the author was. Take a look at what he has to say. He says, tongs, like he used to hold something that's hot. When tongs are strong and fashioned to hold vessels, the craftsman will fashion good vessels. If the tongs are not good, they will never produce well-formed, attractive vessels, right? Meaning, you need to use tongs that are strong to hold whatever it is that you are forging. Similarly, when the body has a deficit of some kind, the intellect cannot function according to that deficit. If there's something wrong with the body, the mind is going to have a problem. Therefore, our complete Torah distanced us from anything that could cause a deficit. These things are bad for you. That's one school of thought. Go ahead.
There is one Hashem, and there's Jews and there's the non-Jews. These apply to Jews. What happened when non-Jews eat these things?
So that's a really good question, right? You have a control group. Right? The whole rest of the world, besides those who are keeping kosher, is their life expectancy different? Is their biology different? Don't laugh, that idea has been suggested.
Or the intellect, too.
Well, aside from the intellect that that point that he raises, but he's telling you that there's going to be a lack of good health. I mean, not to mention, look at what we know about health and what we know about kosher, right? We have the K diet, particularly among Ashkenazim, right? The K diet. Kreplach, Kishka, right? Dishes, right? All the things that we have that start with a K. There are a few more, right? That Kugel is another one. Thank you. These are terrible for you. If God was seriously providing medical advice, there's a whole lot missing. It would resolve things, right? 1 year caffeine is bad for you, 1 year caffeine is good for you, eggs are bad for you, eggs are good. Just look in the Torah, Rosh Hashemini, don't worry about it. If it's okay, then you're fine. That's the K diet. Yes, there was a question here. Yeah.
Everybody's organic.
Right.
So are they going to live longer than Jews?
Well, that would be a question also, right? How does organic interplay with any of this? Yes, Jude.
Is it possible that, without being sacrilegious, that this path, Torah study, Kabbalah study, is one of many ways. And as Jews, this would be our way. And just like a placebo works really, really well, if one subscribes to a certain path and takes it in as meaningful and delivering on those values and those beliefs.
Right, so Judah proposes something which is not quite what they're saying, but is an interesting extra way to read it, which is to say, it will have a salutary effect on you. It's going to have a good effect on your health because you're doing something that brings you fulfillment. You're doing something in which you find meaning because God prescribed this for you. That in of itself can have a salutary effect. It's a great idea. I just don't think it's what they're suggesting. Maimonides clearly did not believe this. Rambam clearly did not believe this.
Rambam was a doctor.
He was a doctor. Yeah.
Is it another way, when you say a control group, is another way of God controlling that we're thinking about Him all the time? Because we're adhering to these principles?
Right. Good. So we're going to come back to that. We're not there yet, but shortly.
You brought, since you did use Rambam.
I didn't yet. I'm about to.
I was...
Oh, you're on the next page. I'm not on the next page yet. Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking that he really wasn't he didn't buy into this whole Kabbalah thing. Not totally anyway. He had a certain...
The answer is sort of.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate about how Maimonides approached Kabbalah. He was not a believer in certain ideas which Kabbalah promotes. That's for sure. That is accurate. However, keep in mind that the line between what today is called science and what today is called metaphysics or philosophy didn't exist. That line wasn't there back in the day. Science to them was included what today would be called mysticism. So it's harder to draw that line, and there's a lot of debate as to what Maimonides believed when it came to mysticism. But what I'm drawing on with Maimonides on this point about health and kashrut is that in his medical aphorisms, he comments that the healthiest kind of animal meat is pork. The healthiest kind of animal meat is pork. Chazer, Maimonides. He isn't recommending that Jews eat it. This is his medical book.
Yeah.
He also says that the least healthy type of bread is matzah.
Well, that's right.
The reason for
That's
that,
why we only eat it for 7.
right? The reason for that is because much of Maimonides' medicine is based on digestion.
Yeah.
That's a lot of the medicine of his day, which is true going back to Galen in the 2nd century, is digestion oriented. So it's not surprising that he would say that. He still says you have to eat matzah, and he still says you can't eat pork. But my point is only to say he doesn't believe that kashrut is about health. Another tack, which goes towards closer to some of the ideas that were stated here, is Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in source number 10. He sought, if you see there, 19th century Germany, he's writing in the first part of the 19th century, he sought to address the arguments of reform in his day. And one of the big flashpoints between the traditionalists and reformists was this issue of keeping kosher. So he writes, the human meal, although in itself a physical function, is ennobled and elevated above other animal functions by the fact that the organ which serves it is at the same time the servant of the noblest human activity, of human speech. Right? He says eating is physical, but you're using the mouth, which is also spiritual. The mouth of man is, on account of its functions, eating and speech, also the reconciling bond between spirit and animal. You use the mouth as a spirit, and you use the mouth as an animal. Therefore, our sages dedicated the meal as the first step towards the ennoblement of the animal in man. And that is why you should approach your meal as you would a holy activity. So it's not about it being physically healthy, it's about it being spiritually healthy. And so you have a different way to look at it. Adrian, I think this goes back to what you were saying. And later on, you find additional ideas that come with this. So, the idea that's become very popular over the last century or so is that kashrut has a dimension of separating us from our neighbors. We can't eat what they eat. We have rabbinic legislation going back a couple of thousand years about not eating foods, certain kinds of foods that are prepared by people who are not Jewish. That was meant in order to avoid socializing. That was meant to because everybody knows you eat with somebody. That's how you develop a bond. But it was predicated on this idea that you separate in your eating. That will separate your culture from theirs. So some have argued that that's what kashrut was about from the start, that kind of separation. These are general approaches to kashrut. Then you have those who say that you can actually make statements about particular foods and the laws of kashrut that will teach particular lessons. So Maimonides does this, and here we get them in number 11, regarding blood. He talks about the Tzaba, the Sabaeans, who I believe lived in Yemen. They believed that blood was most impure, but they ate it because they imagined that this would be food for the demons, and by eating it they would link themselves to the demons. Therefore the Torah, which is perfect in the eyes of those who know it, came to remove these sick, deeply rooted notions. The Torah forbade eating blood and was strict in the prohibition exactly as it was strict regarding idolatry. The Torah only stated, "And I will place my face upon such a person," in a negative way, regarding one who eats blood and one who gives his children over to the Molech idol, for eating blood brings one to a type of idolatry, the worship of demons. So in other words, the Torah prohibits eating blood, because it was used in idolatry, and therefore God wants to separate us from idolatry, and He gives us this law of kashrut. Philo does this. Anybody familiar with Philo? So Philo, you go back to, as I wrote here, 1st century Common Era. He sort of bridges the 1st century before the Common Era and Common Era. He's living in the time of the Greeks. He is Jewish, and he attempts to explain Torah in a way that would appeal to Greek society. Here he gives you a lesson about eating animals that chew their cud. He says in number 12, "Now of all the numbers beginning from the unit, from 1, the most perfect is the number 10. And as Moses says, it is the most sacred of all and a holy number. And by it he now limits the races of animals that are clean, wishing to assign the use of them to all those who partake of the constitution which he is establishing." What he's saying there is a little dense. Is that you have actually 10 types of animals that are off limits. I think it was 10 that are kosher. Maybe it was 10 that are kosher. And he gives 2 tests and criteria of the 10 animals, though it is the 10 that are kosher. Of the 10 animals thus enumerated by 2 signs. First, that they must parch the hoof, split hooves. Secondly, they must chew the cud. For those which do neither, or only one of these things, are unclean. And these signs are both of them symbols of instruction and of the most scientific learning, by which the better is separated from the worse, so that all confusion between them is prevented. For as the animal which chews the cud, while it is masticating its food, draws it down its throat, and then by slow degrees kneads and softens it, and then after this process again sends it down into the belly. In the same manner, the man who is being instructed, having received the doctrines and speculations of wisdom in his ears from his instructor, derives a considerable amount of learning from him, but still is not able to hold it firmly and to embrace it all at once, until he has resolved over in his mind everything which he has heard by the continued exercise of his memory. And this exercise of memory is the cement which connects ideas, and then he impresses the image of it all firmly on his soul. It comes in at the ears, and then you have to digest it, and you have to think about it, and you have to review it. It's like chewing your cud. I mean, that's an expression people use, right? What's the term, actually, for the cud related that is used for thinking deeply about something? Thank you. Ruminating. Right? Ruminating comes from the rumen. Right? The rumen is that stomach, right? Within the 5 stomachs of the animal. I should have thought of that. I put it on the sheet. But it's still true, even if it's not on your sheet. But the idea of ruminating, that your reflection on an idea is like the animal chewing its cud. You are learning a lesson about that. And then the split hooves also he takes on. That you have 2 paths, one towards vice and one towards virtue. So you get symbolism in particular lessons. Nonetheless, and this goes back to what Diane said, despite the broad attempts to explain kashrut, and despite the particular attempts for specific lessons like the blood, nonetheless, what it comes down to is what I said to Ricky before, source number 13, the Midrash. Rav taught the mitzvot were given only to purify people. You want to know why God gave you the mitzvot? It is to purify people. What does that mean? First, let's finish this Midrash. He says, when you shaft an animal, shechita requires that you cut the animal's neck from the front, not from the back. Now, we have all sorts of explanations for shechita, the most popular one being that it's meant to be as painless as possible. You sever the blood vessels, the messages from the brain are no longer going through, the oxygen drop, the whole thing. We're not doing that biology right now. But the point is, he says that's not why. Why would God care whether we slaughter an animal from the front or back of the neck? Doesn't matter to God. The mitzvot were given only to purify people. And the idea here seems to be, I'm saying it in brief because I want to get to some of the Kabbalah of Kashrut today. So we're on the rational side of things right now. What he says is that having a human being develop the discipline to think about God and to show devotion to God when you're going to eat is the benefit of Kashrut. The fact that when I go to the supermarket and there's something I need for a recipe, and I have to look and see, is this something that is certified kosher or is it not, is an act of religious devotion. You may not think about it while you're racing through the supermarket, but that's what you're doing. You're demonstrating loyalty to God. And it happens all the time, because I like cooking, that I will look up a recipe and it'll have an ingredient that I'm trying to find. I go to the supermarket and it's not there, and I have to say, okay, so I can't make this. Or go to Sobeys and pay 5 times the price and you'll find it. Sorry, that's on the recording. It's a statement of devotion to God for somebody to say, you know what, I'd like to try that, and I'm not going to do it. That's what this midrash is saying. It is what we call in Hebrew, a chok, a law for which you're not given explanations. It's simply so.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
Bonus, it made sense. But Kabbalah is not happy with answers like that. Kabbalah says there's something else going on. There's wiring behind the wall. And so what Kabbalah does, taking what we did in our first half hour or so this morning, right, where it says there's something else going on. There's private information that doesn't appear in the biblical text, that's not answerable to debate, that's been passed down from the beginning, teacher to student, that can address why in front of the wall you're getting laws like eat this and don't eat that. That can explain the light switch. And so Kabbalah says there's something more going on here. And we're going to start on it now, and it'll have to continue into the beginning of next week. I apologize.
And the Kabbalah thinks it's important for us to know this because it's always
No.
self-elevates us.
Nope. Kabbalah does not believe it's important for you to know this. Remember, Kabbalah is passed down only to initiates, and there's no mandate of spread this to the world. Now, I should note, there's a lot of debate on this, which we're not going to discuss right now, but there's debate as to, when you study Kabbalah, are you fulfilling the mitzvah of studying Torah at all? Some argued, absolutely. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, I believe, was one of them, who said that's part of Torah, and it's a mitzvah of Torah study. Others have argued that no, that's not part of the mitzvah. But let's see a little bit about what it is within Kabbalah that affects our understanding of Kashrut, and we'll have to continue with it next time. So there's a basic thesis within this mystical tradition that says that everything in the world serves a religious purpose and has an identity in relation to God. Nothing in this world is spiritually neutral. Everything serves God in some way. Everything has a relationship with God in some way. The table is a vehicle for me to study Torah. Look at that. We can put our materials down. You could write notes. It's something that is positive. It has an identity to it, not just on this very utilitarian level that I just identified for the table, but in its basic nature. It has a relationship with God. And often that means even that something which appears bad has a positive aspect to its existence. Take a look, please, at source number 14 as an example. Classic passage in the Talmud. It's talking about an event that occurred in the beginning of the Second Temple period, or towards the beginning of the Second Temple period, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. The biblical text describes the Jews calling out to God, as you see the quote here, in a great voice. And the Talmud asks, what were they saying? What was this great voice? What did they say to God? And we get a remarkable passage. Rabbi Yochanan said the following: Woe to us! Woe, woe! This is the one who destroyed the temple, burned his sanctuary, killed all the righteous people, and exiled Israel from their land, and still he dances among us. What are they talking about? In context, if you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you find out they're talking about idolatry. How they have fallen time and again into the worship of the gods of the nations around them. And they cry out to God and they say, we can't deal with this. It's too much. The temptation for it is simply too much. It has led to such destruction. You only gave him to us, this temptation to worship idols, so that we could receive reward for defeating it. We would grow from this experience. We don't want him. We don't want his reward. And what the Talmud does, building on this story in Ezra and Nehemiah, is to say they fasted 3 days and 3 nights, because 3 is a good number for this purpose. Longer discussion, why 3? And God gave it to them. God said, okay, I'm reducing the temptation for idolatry, which is the Talmud's answer for the question of why it is that today, I don't find idolatry to be particularly attractive. And even in the time of the Talmud, they say, yeah, we're not particularly interested in following the Greek gods, the Roman gods. They're not of interest to us. So Christianity is a good question, but not for right now, just because I got like 5 minutes to go. If you asked the question an hour ago, we could have had a nice digression on it. So you have to remember to ask it in the beginning. It's a good question, so I'm going to follow up. When I do my follow-up email afterwards, I will include a note on it, because it's an important question to ask. So the point here, and this source, is to say that's why you don't really feel such an attraction for worshiping idols. God got rid of it. But then look at the continuation. They said, the Jews of that time said, well, this is a time of mercy. God's answering us. Let's ask for mercy regarding the Yetzer for immorality, this desire that people have to commit an immoral act. Let's ask God to remove that. They prayed, and it was given into their hands. God said, okay, fine. No more Yetzer hara for that. No more desire for that. And they said, see that if we were to kill it, the world would be destroyed. If you eliminate it altogether, then people won't want to procreate. That's no good. So we can't kill it. We just have to preserve it, sort of keep it in line. But they imprisoned it for 3 days and sought a fresh egg in Israel and couldn't find one. Meaning, you can't do without it. That which drives people to procreate is also what drives people into crossing boundaries in that regard. The point for our purposes is not so much the idolatry discussion as this part of it, which is to say everything has a positive and a negative. Everything has a religious purpose. Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, in source number 15, wrote that this is true in general regarding sin. He says sin is useful in that it leads to growth. He says natural regret, which burns in the heart, when a person feels bad, I did something I shouldn't have done, is one of the traits of tshuva, of repentance. From the soul's pain at its stagnation rather than ascent. And all the more so if it feels descent within itself. If you feel like you are stagnating religiously, spiritually, that drives you to grow. That doesn't mean he's recommending that people stagnate, or that he's recommending that people do something bad in order to have rocket fuel to drive them forward. But he's saying that's the function that it serves. When a person makes mistakes, right? Mistakes are tuition. It helps you in terms of your growth. Everything in the universe has a spiritual purpose. Nothing is spiritually neutral. And now we come back to our opening source. We're going to see a lot more about this, but just to go back to the opening source. What is being suggested here, when we said that the non-kosher creatures come from the attribute of justice, and the kosher creatures come from the attribute of mercy, the Kabbalah is trying to say, don't look at the universe and say, kosher must be the good animals, and non-kosher are the bad animals. Don't read it that way. Everything has a role. Everything has a function. But God wants you to go this route, and not that route. He wants you to err on the side of mercy, and not on the side of justice, in terms of what you absorb into yourself. Now you have a problem, right? Because the problem is that we believe, as we said in the beginning, justice is a good thing. So what are you telling me here? So that's something we're going to have to talk about next week when we continue in this mystical take. We're going to have to talk about where this idea comes from in the rational Torah as well. Is this an idea that's found within more mainstream Torah? And develop some conclusion about what this can teach us about Kabbalah's approach to mitzvot. But hopefully what we emerge with this is a basic understanding of the idea of this received tradition and how we know there is such a thing within Judaism. Some sense of what the issues are in Kashrut, what we're trying to answer, and how rational Judaism has tried to answer it, both Kashrut broadly and specific examples of it, like the blood example or chewing the cud. And then we've started on the Kabbalistic idea that you are what you eat. That's really what this is saying. You are what you eat. Nothing in this world is spiritually neutral, but there are certain traits you're looking to absorb which are represented by these creatures, and not by those, and therefore you're avoiding those. We'll have to continue with it, God willing, next week. Thank you very much.